Step into the past with me, won't you? Let's just have a little adventure together. I wonder if you've ever had an experience like this. It's almost sunset, and bright reds and yellows and peach tones light up the foothills of the Rockies outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming, where my family lives. My sister and I have gathered up our sleeping bags and tied them to the back of our horses' saddles. Under my arm, I clutch the big steel thermos of hot cocoa that Mom has filled for us for our adventure. We ride our horses up to the top of the ridge near our house. Our house is far out of town. When it gets dark, it gets really dark, and it's dusk. And as the darkness settles, we roll out our sleeping bags and we snuggle in for the big show. The horses drop their noses into the deep grass nearby, and a hush settles over us, and all we hear is the rhythm of the crickets and the sound of the horses chewing the grass. And we watch as the night sky deepens. It's July 1979, and we've been hearing on the news for weeks about Skylab, this space satellite that's going to fall from the sky. So my sister and I, we think we're going to go out and we're going to get ourselves a look at that thing. So we have set out on this special vigil, and our parents have given us the stamp of approval. With our backs to the ground on top of our sleeping bags, we gaze upward at a night sky filled with stars. It's as though, have you ever done this? Have you ever looked up at the stars? It's like you can touch them. It's so dark, and the stars are that bright. And we are dizzied by our sense of our place in the universe. We say to each other how small we feel. We note that the light from the stars we see now has been in transit for millions of years before it reached our eyes. We ponder, why is there something? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist at all? We have that feeling that you get right here, that feeling of smallness in the face of the grand cosmic scale of the universe, and it fills us with a spreading warmth in our chests. A sense of awe, of wonder, of grandeur fills us. My sister Denise and I did not see Skylab that night, but we saw ourselves and each other. And we saw the night sky, and we had a lovely talk on the ride home. That was some 30 years ago, and it's been about 20 years that I've been coming around Vashon, because you may have heard I have a sister who has a cabin on Spring Beach Road on the island, but that still makes me very new here. I've been here like 5 minutes. And people welcoming me told me stories about ways to kind of become acquainted, like be sure and see the Point Robinson Lighthouse. Did it? And other things like be sure and go to the Church of the Great Rain. So I'm really sad because I heard that this was the best way to really get inside the whole island mentality. It's like this big talent show where people get up and they tell jokes and stories and they sing songs, and it's all about life on the island. Is that what your experience is of this thing? So I heard that it provides the answer to why should we keep Vashon weird? And sadly, the Church of the Great Rain is on hiatus this fall because some of the devoted volunteers who make this annual event possible need some time to regroup and revision, rest, something we all need. So we're going to honor that, and we're going to send them our blessings and celebrate that. But we miss church. And I for one, was really looking forward to it. So this reflection today is called The Church of the Tiny Raindrop, in honor of the Church of the Great Rain, to pay homage to the church, but also to get inside our first source of Unitarian Universalism, because it talks about how we are all tiny raindrops, but together we make a great ocean. Now, in case you don't know what I mean by the first source, if this is news for you, no, that's fine, we're going to cover it. In our Unitarian Universalist tradition, we have 7 principles and 6 sources. And I would just like to play Vanna White for a moment here. Look at this! This is a beautiful gift from Mary Van Gemmert. This is our 7 principles and 6 sources. And I invite you to open your hymnal. And go ahead and grab your gray hymnal and flip past the title page. It's in the very front. And flip past the table of contents. And look for that page that, just like this, starts with "We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association." Do you see that? Where it says, "The living tradition we share," down kind of in the middle of the page, "the living tradition we share draws from many sources." So I invite us to read together the sentence of our first source. Okay? Direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and openness to the forces that create and uphold life. Woo! You guys are great. Thank you. That's a lot, isn't it? That's our first source, one of 6. So that's just so much. I thought we would just take some time and reflect on that and open that up together this morning. So let's ask, where does this source come from? If you want, you can put your hymnal away. Or if you want to read them all, that's fine too. Or if you just want to close your eyes and relax, if that's what you need to do, that's fine too. So why do we name direct experience the very first source of our tradition? Well, this source goes way back into the roots of both our Unitarian side of our family tree and the Universalist side. But I'd like to take a look at the Unitarian side of the family today. In the 1820s, the Unitarians were feeling some tensions. There was some change afoot in their movement. And they were really trying to struggle with this, and this tension came forward and erupted actually into a national movement in the United States. It was really, some people say, I'm not an English literature teacher, but some people say it was the first literary movement of this new country. And some of its key figures were Margaret Fuller, maybe you've heard of her, Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Okay, these were all Unitarians. In fact, it was Emerson who said that we were all tiny raindrops, but together we make a great ocean, in his 1841 essay, The Oversoul. And that's where the title of this reflection comes from. Emerson and these other folks call themselves transcendentalists. And like Emerson, many members of the Transcendentalist Club, yes, there really was a club in Boston, were Unitarian ministers. And they attracted a lot of attention through their writings, their speeches, their public witness, and they had a literary journal called The Dial, which was edited by Margaret Fuller, a very important literary magazine in its time. And they were also famous for departing from Christianity's roots. This was scandalous, as you can imagine. They brought together a craving for social reform. Many of them worked in the forefront of abolition and women's rights. And many of them were naturalists. I mean, think of Henry David Thoreau. They had a craving for nature, and they also celebrated the individual. This was all part of the Transcendentalist movement. They also delved into the mystical traditions from around the world. This was the time when German intellectualism was kind of at its peak in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. And the Germans were getting all of these books, these writings from the Middle East, and they were translating them into Western languages. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was this very fluent cosmopolitan guy, and he read Hafez, Rumi, Hindu works like the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana. He read these things in German translation. They were fresh and new to Emerson. Of course, they were ancient to the cultures that created them, but to Emerson, they were mind-blowing. They opened him up. And so he was transported by these sources, and he found a common thread underlying all the works of the world's wisdom traditions. And he developed this sense that all these religions were pointing at the same thing, this thing that he called the oversoul. This is a term he brings in from Hinduism, right? So you can imagine, this was a source of tension. Was Emerson a Christian? Or was he something more than Christian? Or perhaps just totally different than Christian? This was big doings back then. And it was the age-old conflict between the old and the new. the traditional and the emerging, the establishment and the counterculture. It's hard for us looking back on this time to think of the transcendentalists as kind of like the countercultural guys, but they were, and women, they were. And this was a point of departure for the transcendentalist Unitarians. They separated themselves. Well, they got separated. There was an argument. There was an argument between the Orthodox Unitarians and these new emerging traditional or transcendentalist Unitarians. And it was a scandal in New England leading up to the years of the Civil War. So I just wanted to give you a little backdrop of what we're talking about as we explore our first source. Our first source, just in case you forgot what it was, it's so long. The direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and openness to the forces that create and uphold life. So, what does this first source do for us? I have some suggestions. I suggest it gives us a radically new idea of what it means to be human. A radically new idea of how to relate to the ultimate, what Emerson called the source or the ground of being, or sometimes he called it God. So for the purposes of this sermon, I might use that word God. Can I have your permission to kind of use that as a nickname for all those other things as well? I'm not trying to impose anything on you. I seriously want your permission. Okay? Lowercase, absolutely. I'm going to put a lowercase g on that word each time you hear it. So what is the idea of being human? Before we talk about the idea of what it means to be God, what is our idea of being human that is implied by our first source? That each of us has that divine spark, that thing inside of us, that tiny raindrop of the great oversoul, as Emerson would put it. It's this spark that naturally allows us to relate to the divine, that leads us to a very particular stance as well, not just to the divine, but to our fellow human beings. This sense of the tiny raindrop in the great oversoul is something that we instantly recognize in others if we tend to it. We all have an innate capacity to relate to the divine. And this is why we don't need a lot of rituals to bring human beings closer to the divine. I'm doing this, but it could be this, right? Or it could be this. We don't need a lot of rituals to bring to close that gap, right? We are already close to the divine, as Emerson said. Emerson was one of the ones who actually got rid of the ritual of communion in the Unitarian service. He said, why are we doing this? This makes no sense for us to do this. We could just as well be doing foot washing if we wanted to follow Jesus. We don't need these rituals. Somebody is seconding the foot washing idea. I'm warning you right now.
Yes, yes. Well, especially since last week we learned what the foot was. It brings
Oh,
a
yeah.
meaning.
After the washing comes the massage.
This is a very lively bunch. So I just want to say, Emerson would affirm with you all that the divine is right here. It is right here. We don't need to go out and find it. It's right here, and right here, and right here, and it's right because of this tiny raindrop that participates in the great ocean, we have a stance for nonviolence. That's something else that flows out of our first source. We have a stance for pluralism. Pluralism is the idea that religions all have an equal say, that every religion has a place at the table. We are very friendly toward other religions. In fact, we don't assert that we have a corner on the market of truth. Far from it. We say that to be human is to embark on a process of discovery. And so our first source gives us another gift. We focus on being human, that everyone has the divine, that we are nonviolent because everyone has the divine. And it also gives us a focus on the here and now, this moment, today. I'd like to tell a story that Patrick O'Neill, my colleague, tells about a memorial service he led early in his career. he met with the family of the deceased woman, who consisted of her husband and her 2 adult daughters. They got together, and from what they said and what they didn't say, he could tell that the woman had lived a difficult life. Her relationships were strained, and he thought he experienced her story as being kind of brittle. And when he asked what she loved and what gave her life meaning, the daughters told Patrick what she really loved. It was her set of fine china. See, this was in the day when the checker at the supermarket gave you your receipt and your change and your S and H green stamps. The woman of good farm family stock who had grown up in the Depression saved these stamps religiously and then cashed them in as soon as she had enough to get a set of fine china. She, over the course of decades, acquired this set of service for 8 in this pattern that she just loved. And so when each piece arrived in the mail, she would open it up and she would carefully unwrap it and she would look at it and gaze at it and admire the pattern. And then she carefully wrapped it back up and put it in a box and stored it under her bed. This woman never used her china because she was afraid of breaking one of the pieces. After her memorial service, according to the story, with their dad's cooperation, her daughters carefully slid that box of china out from under the bed, dusted it off, and got out that fine china and used it to serve some friends a small dinner at their parents' home. And after this dinner, after the guests had left, the daughters were standing in the kitchen and talking about their mother's legacy, sometimes painful to them. And they were washing the dishes. And as sometimes it happens when the cups are slippery, a cup broke. It fell and it broke. And it broke them open to tears. And they were holding each other in the kitchen. They were holding the soapy cut cup. And they said to each other, at least we got to honor Mother's life with this china that she loved. And this other sister said, that's right. We risked using the china. It's okay. It's okay that something broke. At least we risked using the china. We each of us have our own experience of the transcendent. We each of us have something that we love, that turns us on, that sets us on fire. What's yours? What's yours? How will you find it? Will you hoard it under your bed out of fear of breaking a piece of it? Or will you risk joyously using it every week, maybe every day? Our first source leads us into living in the here and now. It doesn't focus us on some potential, maybe, perhaps, possible afterlife where we can use our china. It focuses us on this life. So the moral of the story is what? Use the china. Use the china. Our first source gives us an idea of what it means to be human. That's what we've been talking about. A stance toward nonviolence, a stance toward pluralism, and a focus on the here and now, on this precious earth, this life, this planet. It also gives us a radically different idea about the nature of the ultimate. Emerson called this the ground of being, or the great oversoul, or the great ocean. He wrote, "It is an ebb of the individual rivulet before the flowing surges of the sea of life. Every distinct apprehension of this distinct commandment agitates people with awe and delight. Every moment when the individual feels it, it is invaded by the memorable." Emerson was Jane Austen's contemporary, and he used a lot of words, but here's what I think he's saying. He's talking about that direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. He's talking about that star-filled night, that thing that turns us all on. The china dish that, so beautiful. Just want to watch it in the sunshine. He's using, though, you might notice, he's using poetic metaphorical language to try to relate to this experience and to generalize it. This is another gift from our first source. Have you noticed that our tradition has way more poets than, we tend to honor poets more than we do theologians? That's a good thing, right? Do you remember this song from The Sound of Music? How do you solve a problem like Maria? How do you catch a cloud and pin it down? There's this scene where the nuns are dancing around and they're singing about Maria, right? She's this beautiful, youthful, vibrantly, sexually alive young woman. And like she's a problem to solve. To them, she's a problem. But ultimately, as they sing the song and they dance around in musicals, this is what happens. They decide it can't be done. Ultimately, they acknowledge that solving a problem like Maria is like pinning down a cloud. Wise nuns. Like the Buddhists, like the nuns in The Sound of Music, Unitarian Universalists understand that God, with a little g, or the ultimate, or the oversoul, whatever language you feel comfortable with, is not a problem to be solved. Trying to define the ultimate is like pinning down a cloud or trying to contain a young person in love. This is the wisdom of our first source. It comes to us as a felt sense. We believe that divinity, whatever you want to call it, is something that we feel in our bodies, that we know intuitively. It's not locked down like a dogma pinned to a piece of cardboard like a dead butterfly. Experiencing divinity, our first source says, is more like watching that young woman roaming over the foothills of the Alps, in love with life, feeling it surge in her body, and swinging her arms in this wide embrace. Can you just see her, Julie Andrews, in the grass? She's singing at the top of her lungs that what? The hills are alive. With what? The sound of music. Thank you. Our first source gives us this deep knowledge that knowing divinity is something that we all have capacity for. And yet, we don't have to check our brains at the door. We shouldn't. We also believe in the scientific method, and we tend to be skeptical of the mystical, because whenever someone takes their experience of the mystical and tries to impose it on everyone, well, something bad happens. We know that when people start making pronouncements about the divine, start trying to catch that cloud and pin it down, the next thing that happens is oppression. We can talk about this, but our people have been burned at the stake. We know this in our lived experience. Our martyrs remind us of that. Mary Oliver reminds us of that. So, I contend that our first source leads directly to our first principle. Our first principle is the respect for the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That's on here too. Because we believe in every person's divine spark. We naturally believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So how I would work this for us today is this. To be Unitarian is to acknowledge that the ultimate force in this life is love. And even though evil exists, love is greater than fear. Love, that felt sense inside, that feeling in the starlit night, is greater than fear. We are held in a larger love. We are held in a great ocean of love. And to be a universalist is to acknowledge that the tiny raindrop of divinity is in each of us, so we say each person is precious and unique. So the invitation for us is to live from that center. So the invitation is to be married to amazement. Swing out your arms and take the world into them. Express your joy. Remember that life, however fragile, is a gift. Use the china. May it be so. So I invite you now into a time of prayer and meditation. So if it is your custom to just relax your body and close your eyes, you're welcome to do that, or keep your eyes